no more committed to the principles that the CIA stands for. There's no individual more committed to the principles that the CIA stands for than Senator Rockefeller, and he feels that more needs to be done to ensure that Congress has the power to do responsible oversight. And Senator Udall and Senator Collins and Senator Heinrich are all ones that share that view as well. And in doing that, we recognize that we have a responsibility and that ultimately it's up to American voters to decide whether Congress is fulfilling its obligation to conduct vigorous oversight of the executive branch's actions and activities. So let me then turn to the question that has received most of the attention today and is really about what I'd like to explore for a moment or two with my colleague from Kentucky. The President has also said, and I was encouraged by a number of his comments, including the State of the Union address, that with respect to counter-terror efforts, no one should take his word for it, that the administration is doing things the right way. And as part of that, he said he was going to engage the American people in a discussion of these kinds of issues. And when it comes to continuing the public debate about the rules for conducting targeted killings, there are a number of questions that need to be explored, and one that I will address to Senator Paul involves this question that he and I have been interested in for some time, and that is the question of the geographic limitation with respect to the use of lethal authority. And Senator Paul and I and others have been asking for some time is what are the limits with respect to these lethal authorities, and in particular whether they can be used inside the United States. And having listened to a bit of the comments made by Senator Paul with confirmation hearings tomorrow, we haven't gotten all of them, but certainly the point that the Senator has made this afternoon is an issue that I and others have asked of the Attorney General for some time, and we haven't been able to get an answer. We haven't been able to get an answer. In recent weeks, Senator Paul has sent a number of letters on this topic. He's received 2 responses, and he shared them with me. Now, I would just say, for purposes of this question, I think the response from John Brennan, and he stated quite clearly his view on this, was quite constructive. He said the CIA does not conduct lethal operations inside the United States, and most importantly, as per the conversations the Senator from Kentucky and I have had, Mr. Brennan said the CIA does not have the authority to conduct those operations. So he was unequivocal with respect to what would happen if he was confirmed as the head of the CIA, that he would not have the authority to conduct those operations. So for purposes of anybody's kind of keeping score, I just say that Mr. Brennan, on the questions that the Senator from Kentucky and I have been interested in, he was clear and forthright. And I've been interested in this for some time. I'm glad the Senator from Kentucky has asked the question. We have now gotten an answer that is unequivocal from Mr. Brennan. So that then brings us to the second response from Attorney General Holder. This letter repeated the statement that the U.S. government has not carried out any drone strikes inside the United States and that the Obama administration has no intention of doing so. It goes on to say that the Obama administration rejects the use of military force where well-established law enforcement authorities in the country provide the best means for incapacitating a terrorist threat. I would certainly agree with this position. It's clear to me that prosecutions in federal court provide a tough, effective means for dealing with terrorist suspects, which is why there are a great many terrorists who are now sitting in American prisons today, locked behind bars, which is exactly where they belong. The Attorney General went on to state, and I quote here, "It's possible to imagine an extraordinary circumstance such as Pearl Harbor or the 9/11 attacks in which, quote, it would be necessary and appropriate under the Constitution and laws of the United States for the President to authorize the military to use lethal force within the territory of the United States." And this is what I'd like to unpack a little bit with my colleague from Kentucky, having asked this question a number of times and thinking a lot about what the answer ought to be. On this particular issue, it seems to me that the Attorney General has certainly moved in the direction of what we wanted to hear. And I want to just kind of outline it, and I think we agree on most of it, and let's have a chance to exchange some thoughts. One of the core principles of American democracy is that we do not ask our military to patrol our streets. And it was important to me to hear the Attorney General emphasize that principle. I know that there are some who believe that the military ought to be given more domestic counter-terror responsibilities, like capturing and detaining terrorist suspects inside the country. I do not share that view, and I know that the senator from Kentucky does not share that view. And I am grateful that the Obama administration has now said they don't share that view either. In fact, as I have talked about it with a number of colleagues, I actually voted against the annual defense authorization bill for the past 2 years because I was concerned that those two bills didn't address adequately that particular principle. Now, the Attorney General then suggested what I think we would all consider an unlikely scenario, the Pearl Harbor, the 9/11 attacks, in which it would be actually lawful and appropriate for the President to use military force inside the United States. As I read that statement, and this is the point of my question to my friend from Kentucky, it sounds a lot like the language that is in Article 4 of the Constitution, which directs the United States government to protect individual states from invasion. In my judgment, if the United States is being attacked by a foreign power, the 41 attack on Pearl Harbor, the President can indeed have the power to use military force to defend our country. So the reason that I've been asking this question and have been interested in exploring it with my colleague from Kentucky is that I think it's extremely important to establish that unless you have an extraordinary situation, unless there is an exceptional situation like Pearl Harbor, the President should not go around ordering the military to use lethal force inside the United States. Our military, we're very proud of them, plays a vital role in efforts to combat terrorism overseas. But here at home, we rely on the FBI and other law enforcement agencies to track down the terrorists, and they do this job well. So I thought it was helpful to see the Attorney General, as part of what has been discussed here, clarify and establish that the President can only use military force inside the United States in extraordinary circumstances like the Pearl Harbor attack. So I just, in posing this question, wanted to ask, I know that the senator from Kentucky and I have had discussions over this, and I thought about it overnight and thought about our discussions, and my sense is that the senator from Kentucky doesn't believe that the Attorney General's response was clear enough. And I very much respect his view on this point. And one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of walk through briefly a little bit, of history is that I think there are some issues still to be debated on this issue. And my colleague has certainly been correct in asking valid questions because the Attorney General has left open the possibility of using military force inside the United States outside of the extraordinary Pearl Harbor circumstance that I have mentioned. So I say to the senator, I think you're raising some important questions. In fact, some of the most important questions that we could be asking here on the floor of the Senate. It seems to me that the Attorney General has ruled out using military force inside the United States, except in cases of an actual attack by a foreign power. And I understand why my colleague from Kentucky would say that we ought to be engaging more with the administration and be asking for additional insight. So I want it understood that I have great respect for this effort to really ask these kinds of questions, force them to be debated on the floor. And Senator Paul has certainly been digging into these issues in great detail. And frankly, on the question of how we balance American security and American liberty, we have worked together often, and we're certainly going to be working together often on these issues in the days ahead. And I think I would just like to allow the senator from Kentucky to respond to my question, recognizing that while we might differ a bit on the aspect of the Attorney General's response that I have cited this afternoon, that in an instance of an extraordinary threat to our country, the kind of exceptional threat to our country, I do see, almost as part of what Article 4 is about, the President's ability to defend us in those kinds of situations. My colleague from Kentucky may see it differently, and frankly, he's raising important issues, and I'd be interested in his thoughts this afternoon.
Senator from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from Oregon for coming down to the floor, for being a champion for civil liberties, for being a champion for the Bill of Rights. And we get a lot of grief in Washington about lack of civility, people yelling and screaming at each other. And I think in my dealings with Senator Wyden from the other side of the aisle, it's been evident that people can be from different perspectives, find common ground, and also really try to get to a point which really isn't a partisan point. I've tried to make the emphasis since I've been down here that it's not so much about Brennan, that it's about the principles. I've voted for three of the nominations so far of the president, because I think he deserves some latitude in his political nominees. With regard to a couple of things, I think the senator from Oregon hit it really well, that the problem of we have this use of authorization of force on Afghanistan. Most people think that was going to war in Afghanistan, but now it's been so broadly interpreted that it means worldwide war basically forever. And that's sort of why we get into some of these problems, because not only is it worldwide, which is a big debate in itself, now worldwide means us at home too, and that the battlefield is here. I agree with Senator from Oregon that Brennan was very forthright, and it was a little bit onerous getting the response. But once we got the response, it was exactly what was appropriate. He said he would obey the law. The law is very clear. The CIA does not operate in the United States. The only problem is not with his response, but that the Department of Defense is the one directing the drone program, so it doesn't really answer the final question. On Holder's response, if it would have been written by the senator from Oregon as he states it, there probably wouldn't be so much problem. I think that maybe the recounting of the letter gives it a little more strength than the letter actually possesses in its own words. If he were to say that we were ruling out all strikes other than extraordinary strikes, that would actually be a pretty good letter. But instead he says that he can imagine, I suppose, under certain circumstances that, and he lists a couple circumstances. And the interesting thing is Pearl Harbor and 9/11, a lot of us agree. Probably you, probably me. We all agree we can repel a military attack. The reason we ask the next question, and the reason I'm concerned about the next question, and I've only seen the unclassified versions of these, but the unclassified versions of the drone attacks indicate that a significant amount of them are not killing people with a weapon. People like to talk about if you take up arms. Well, a lot of these people aren't in arms. It doesn't make them good people, but they aren't carrying arms around. They're not actively shooting our soldiers or us. And so the question becomes is, at the particular time they're killed, they look like non-combatants. And so if you have somebody who's sitting in a cafe in our country, even if they are a bad person, you'd probably rather arrest them. One, they would get the due process of our country. And then two, if arrested you and they were bad people, you might actually get some information from them. So I would like to see a little bit better wording. And then the last thing I would say, and then I'd appreciate hearing your response, is Attorney General was in the Judiciary Committee this morning and was asked a bunch of questions on this. And I've looked through the transcript of a couple of them, and it's still like pulling teeth. I mean, he was asked 4 times, do you think it's constitutional to kill someone in a cafe, in Seattle or Houston or Louisville, and he kept saying it wasn't appropriate, but language is important. You know, when we're talking about this, appropriate's not strong enough. It's sort of like the president saying, I have no intention. We really just want to say he won't, you know, not having intention. So he finally didn't quite put it together in his response, but in his response combined with the questioning, you can get the opinion that maybe he thinks it's not constitutional to kill non-combatants having dinner. But boy, wouldn't it be a lot easier if they'd just say that? And at this point, I'd entertain a question without yielding the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon is recognized.
Just respond to the senator from Kentucky's point in noting the fact that he would not be giving up the floor in the process. I think that the senator from Kentucky is making an important point, and the way I read it, it really would focus on ensuring that our country would be protected against those kind of exceptional circumstances. And I would just like to leave the discussion here by noting that I think both of us feel that this is just the beginning of this debate. The nature of warfare has changed so dramatically. We are going to have to, and I particularly appreciate the chance to work on this in a bipartisan way, we are going to have to be continually digging in and trying to excavate more information about how all of this actually works without in any way jeopardizing sources and methods and kind of ongoing operations. I think we can do it. And with respect to how I read particularly that part of the letter, and I thought a lot about it, I said I think that the two of us and others who can be part of, we can call it the checks and balances caucus, but we can just make sure that people understand it's about liberty and security. I think we can flesh this out more in the days ahead. I know that I've had 4 sessions now with the classified, documents that were made available as a member of the Intelligence Committee, and I still have a lot of questions. And some of those I think we will have to ask in a classified way, but I think others of them we can ask in a public way, and the two of us can work on that together. I also think there's a very strong case for beginning to declassify some of the information with respect to these drone policies, and I think that can be done as well, consistent with protecting our national security. So I think the senator from Kentucky has made a number of important points this afternoon. I thank him for the chance to work with him on these issues, and look forward to continuing this discussion in the days ahead, and appreciate this time this afternoon.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
A lot of the process for getting this information wouldn't have happened without the senator from Oregon as well as the senior senator from Georgia, both working together to get information. It's really the way the system ought to be working. And one of the, I think, good things about the body is both Republicans and Democrats working together to get information from not necessarily adversarial, but in a way adversarial, another branch of government. We are a branch of government, but it's not partisan against partisan. It's bipartisan, working for the power of the checks and balances to try to ensure a leveling. But I want to thank him for helping to get the information to make this a much fuller debate. Mr. President, at this time, without yielding the floor, I'd like to entertain a question from the senator from Florida.
Florida is recognized.
Thank you for the opportunity. Let me begin by, I know you've been here a while, let me give you some free advice. Keep some water nearby. It's handy. Trust me. Anyway, thank you for entertaining my question. Let me just begin by saying that, because my question to you is about the motivation for being here on the floor for you today. What brought me here a moment, I've been reading some of the accounts of what's going on here, and people are talking about this, the senator from Kentucky's involved in a filibuster. Some are already characterizing it as another Republican filibuster of one of the president's nominees. But just to be clear, I guess my question, because I understand this from everything I've heard you say and have been saying leading up to now, your primary issue that brings you to the floor today is that you've asked a very straightforward question on an issue of constitutional importance, and yet you have not received a straightforward answer. And certainly not only you have not received an answer, but we saw testimony earlier this morning that, quite frankly, I watched the video of it 2 or 3 times, and I personally do not understand why it was so difficult to basically just say yes or no? So I wanted to start out by asking just to be clear, your motivation for being here on the floor today is not to deny the president a vote on one of his nominees. Your motivation is that you have asked this administration a very important and relevant question and have been unable to receive a straightforward answer to that question.
Mr. President, my response to this is that, yes, in fact, I've actually voted for several of the president's nominations. And my trying to draw attention to this issue is because I believe that it's an incredibly fundamental issue, and that is of how you would kill people, Americans on American soil, and whether the Constitution applies, whether the Fifth Amendment applies. So my motivation in doing this is really not partisan. It is something that has to do, and I've said frankly, and I truly mean this, if it were a Republican president today, I would still be in the same place, because the American people deserve answers on this, and there are different rules in war than there are here, and we need to acknowledge and separate ourselves and say we're not in the middle of a battle zone. We still do have Miranda rights. You still do get an attorney in the United States, and it's not the same in a battlefield, but he's bringing battlefield strategy home. We have to know, and he should, before he starts doing it, at least we need to know what are the rules. Does the Constitution apply? Mr. President, I would entertain a further question from the senator from from Florida, without yielding the floor.
Yeah, without yielding the floor, Senator, the follow-up question I have is, because I think this is actually a very useful exercise for the folks that have been snowed in today, and there's nothing better to watch but C-SPAN, or have been able to be with us here today, to actually understand the structure of our government and how it was designed, because it's my personal opinion we've gotten away from some of that. So let me just describe to you for a second my position, and it leads up to the question that I'm going to ask you. I'm actually a member of the Intelligence Committee, which means that we reviewed this nomination. And I have questions that I care about. They were somewhat different than the valid ones that the senator from Kentucky is raising. And as a member of that committee, I asked those questions. The nominee answered those questions. But we have a job to do. I think that's what's important for people to understand. Members of the Senate have an important constitutional role to give advice and consent on these nominations. We have an obligation not just to pass these folks through, but to actually ask serious questions to determine if they're qualified for the position they're going to hold. I mean, you want your senators to be doing that, and both parties, no matter who the president may be. And so I undertook that effort as part of the Intelligence Committee. I asked my questions. I got answers to my questions. Believed that the nominee was qualified. Believed that the president has a right to his nominees, even if they're not the people that we would nominate. Believe that ultimately these nominees deserve a vote. And that's why, for example, yesterday I voted to move this nomination on. Now, just as the president has a right to his nominations and ultimately to have a vote on those nominations, so too do members of the Senate have a right to their role, and in particular to ask relevant questions on issues of important public policy and get answers from the administration. This is not, and I think sometimes this is being lost. We have different branches of government, but they're co-equal branches of government. The presidency, the executive branch, is it an important? Absolutely it's important. It's the commander-in-chief. It's the top single office in the nation. But the legislative branch is a co-equal branch with a job just as important. And in order to do that job, we have to have access to information, the ability to ask relevant questions and get straight answers. And to be frank, sometimes I feel when we ask questions of this administration, like they feel like it's beneath them to answer questions from us from time to time. I think that's very unfortunate. I think my question is, when you're here today, Senator, raising these issues, it's my opinion, and I'd like to hear what you have to say, this is more than just an issue of the constitutionality of this particular program. It's a defense of this institution. It's a defense of the legislative branch. It's a defense of the Senate as an institution, irrespective about how you feel about the nominee or the nomination or the program or where you fall on this constitutional issue. It's a defense of this institution and of its constitutional, not constitutional right, constitutional obligation to ask relevant questions of public policy and to get answers. To ask questions so the people back home will know the answers to these questions. If we're not going to ask these questions, who's going to ask them? The press? Maybe in a press conference, but that's not what they're paid to do. That's what we're paid to do. That's what we were elected to do. So I'd like to hear your views on that, because my belief from what I'm picking up from everything you're saying here today, you're actually on the floor here today standing up for the obligations that this institution has to ask questions like this and to be able to get straight answers to these questions.
Well, Mr. President, I think the senator from Florida's got it exactly right. This is about checks and balances. It's about the co-equal branches of government, and it's about how we limit usurpation of power by checking and balancing each of the different powers. And so, you know, when Montesquieu wrote that there can be no liberty when you combine the executive and the legislative, they were separated for a reason. When the Constitution says that Congress declares we're not the president, it was separated for a reason. So when we look forward to these things, and the senator from Kansas brought this up earlier, when the president says, oh, I have the ability to determine when you are in session or not, and I can do recess appointments when I think you're out of session, boy, that is a great usurpation of power to one branch, and we should fight it as an institution, Republican and Democrat, and not make this partisan, not make these partisan issues. And so I agree with you. I think there is a need for those checks and balances. And by the body not struggling to get as much information from they can, not really even in this case as much about the individual as about the policy, then I think it is a mistake for the body not to do it. And I agree with you completely. It's something that should be defended, and it's not something to be derided as partisan, because I don't see it as partisan at all. I see it as a defense of the separation of powers and of the checks and balances. And, Mr. President, at this time I would yield without yielding the floor for another question.
And this will probably be my last question. Before I get to it, let me just say that, you know, all the other senators that are, and I know some of my colleagues have already come to the floor, and some might be watching or some might be nearby. I would just say this, just think about this for a moment. You may or may not agree with the senator from Kentucky's position on this issue. Maybe you've seen the Attorney General's answer, or you saw his testimony this morning and you're satisfied with it. Maybe you're not that concerned about this issue at all. I don't think that's the issue. I think what we need to remember is that all of us have something we care deeply about, or multiple things we care deeply about, and the day will come. The day will come when something you care about, or some issue you're involved in, or some question that you have, that you will try to raise that question. And it may be under a different administration. I think we have to remember that the president will not be president forever. There'll be a new president in 3.5 years, and after that, and so forth. And some of the folks that are here now may still be here. Some point in the future, all of us will have questions we want answered, and we will have an administration or some other organism of government that refuses to give us answers, straight answers. And when that moment comes, you will want your colleagues to rally to your side, even if they don't agree with you, and defend your right as a representative of the people of your state to ask important questions, particularly questions of constitutional importance, and get straight answers to those questions. It's my feeling here today, and the senator will have to comment on this, if he had just gotten a straight answer to that letter, if he had just gotten a straight answer in the testimony today, this would not be necessary. If simply they would have taken in the question, which I think is a pretty straightforward question, and answered it in a straightforward way, all of this could have been avoided. This nominee could have had a vote. But instead, they've decided to go in a different direction, and it baffles me. But here's the question that I have. I think this is important as well for the folks that are watching back home. Because they may say, well, often they may say, well, why do you have to do it this way? You know, why can't you just ask the question and not have to do this process of stopping things from moving forward? And I think my view is, and I want to share them with the senator and get his impressions, are twofold. Number one, because these are the tools at our disposal. That's why this system was created the way it was designed this way. One of the things that the Senate has at its disposal to preserve and protect its prerogative, to ask important questions of this kind, are the rules that we've set up here. And they don't protect one senator. They protect every senator here. Everyone here, even if I don't agree with you. One of the things that gives you the ability to ask and have questions answered is this role we have in confirming nominees. And secondly, I would say, this is not the Secretary of the Treasury. This is not some other unrelated cabinet position. This is the Central Intelligence Agency, which is directly related to the program that the senator from Kentucky has relevant questions about. And so I guess I'd want to hear from him a little bit more about why he chose this particular nomination and why and how it's relevant to the larger question that he's asking.
Well, Mr. President, the answer to the question is that we've tried the normal channels and have been for a month. We sent the standard letters. We sent 3 different letters to John Brennan, and we didn't get any response. But then when the leverage became used, or the leverage became apparent that both Republicans and Democrats on the Intelligence Committee were asking for more answers, then we finally began to get answers. The answers, unfortunately, didn't quite answer the question. as the day has worn on, we've actually gotten more answers. Since I've been standing here this morning, we've now gotten the report of the Attorney General's testimony before the Judiciary Committee. In that, under withering cross-examination, I guess is the best way to put it, he finally owns up and says, well, maybe somebody in a cafe, it wouldn't be appropriate to kill them in America. But Senator from Texas wanted one step further. We don't want you to say whether it's appropriate. We want you to say whether you think you have the power to do it, whether you think you have the constitutional authority to kill someone who's a non-combatant in a restaurant or in their house or in their church or wherever. Do you think you have the power to kill non-combatants? It's a pretty important question. And I think we may have eked some of the answer out from Attorney General Holder. It would be nice if we would actually get that in clean language where the Attorney General would now say that this is our policy. But see, this comes from allowing the executive branch so much power. If you allow them the power to make the rules, to make the decisions, without any kind of oversight or scrutiny, the danger is that there really will be no process. So the thing is that right now we have a program going on where we kill people around the world with drone strikes. And there are criteria and standards for how we do it. And the obvious question is, you're going to do that in America? Under what standards? We have had at least allegations. We have had some who have said the bulk of the drone strikes around the world have been signature killings, which means that people aren't identified who's being killed, that it's a long line of traffic and we blow up the line of traffic. Now you can debate whether in war you may have a looser criteria for who you're blowing up. But I would think that in America we wouldn't blow up a caravan going from a wedding to a funeral, from a church to the house, from a political meeting back to their home. We would have different rules in America. If you're accused of a crime, if they think you're somehow a terrorist, then they would arrest you, particularly if you're in a non-combat opportunity. Why in the world would the president take the position that if you're eating in a cafeteria, you're eating in a restaurant, you're at home asleep, that you couldn't be arrested? So it's a really easy question. And the president should just very frankly answer the question. I will not kill non-combatants. In America, I mean, I just can't imagine why the president can't answer an easy question. Now, there have been people on both the right and the left that have been asking these questions. Glenn Greenwald writes a lot about this issue. And this is a pretty, I think, interesting proposition that he puts forward. He says, if you posit that the entire world is a battlefield, then you're authorizing him to do anywhere in the world what he can do on the battlefield. That's been my point. If the United States is a battlefield and we're going to have the rule of the laws of war, or another way it can be put, martial law in America, if we're going to have that in America, boy, you need to know about it, because martial law, living under martial law, is the way they live in Egypt. That's why they just had a rebellion in Egypt and overthrew Mubarak, because they had, by martial law, indefinite detention. So those who say the battlefield is here, we need to live under the laws of war in our country, and they tell you to shut up if you want an attorney, by golly, be careful about that. Be quite careful if you're going to let us go to that sense. So Greenwald goes on, he says, if we can do on a battlefield what we can do anywhere, we can do here, kill, imprison, eavesdrop, detain, all without limits or oversight or accountability. That's what the world is a battlefield theory. That's why this is so radical and alarming, not to mention controversial. He also quotes from Esquire, from Charles Pierce, who said, this is why the argument many liberals are making that the drone program is acceptable both morally and as a matter of practical politics, because of the faith that you have in the guy who happens to be presiding over it at the moment. So you'll remember many of these people didn't like George Bush, and they railed and railed about wiretaps. And now they're suspiciously quiet that we get to a killing program. But he says that if you have so much confidence because you like the guy, the president in charge of this, he says that that's criminally naive, intellectually empty, and as false as blue money to the future. He goes on to say that the powers we have allowed to leach away from their constitutional points of origin into that office have created in the presidency a foul strain of outlawry. That worse is now seen as the proper order of things. If that is the case, and the author says he believes it is, then the very nature of the presidency of the United States at its core has become a vehicle for permanently unlawful behavior. This is coming from a liberal. Every 4 years we elect a new criminal because that's become the precise job description. So we have to ask some important questions. I'm not asking any questions about the president's motives. I don't question his motives. I frankly don't think he will be killing people in restaurants tonight or in their house tonight. But this is about the rule of law. It isn't so much about him. It isn't so much about John Brennan. It's about having rules so that someday if we do have the misfortune of electing someone you do not trust, electing someone who might kill innocent people, who might kill people that they disagree with politically, or they might kill people who they disagree with religiously, or might kill people of another ethnic group, we're protected. That's what these protections are about. But they aren't so much about the individuals involved now. But there is a program that's going on around the world that is killing individuals with drones. And it's done in a warlike fashion. And the thing is that in war you don't get due process. So these people around the world don't get Miranda rights, and I'm not arguing for that. If you have a gun leveled at an American in Afghanistan, you're going to be killed with no due process. I'm not arguing for that. But I am arguing that it's different if you're in Afghanistan pointing a weapon at us, or here pointing a weapon at us. It is different if you're eating dinner or if you're in your home at night. So I think there are clear and distinct differences, and there's no excuse for the president not giving us a clear-cut answer. There's a writer by the name of Connor Friedersdorf who writes for The Atlantic. I'll get into that in just a minute. At this time, Mr. President, I'd like to, without yielding the floor, stop for a question from the senator from Georgia.
Well, I thank the senator from Kentucky, and first of all, let me say I appreciate the senator's passion. I appreciate the fact that, as he knows, he and I have had some discussions about this issue over the last several days and weeks, and I appreciate you bringing this to the forefront as you've done. We have talked about your question that you submitted to Mr. Brennan for answering, and this is not a rocket science question. This is a question that is perfectly reasonable, perfectly rational, and a question that ought to be able to be addressed by the administration in a very quick, simple, direct response. And I have been dumbfounded, as the senator from Kentucky knows, about the fact that you didn't get a straightforward, simple answer immediately. But the fact of whether or not a drone attack, and I am one of those who thinks that we need to detain and interrogate folks as opposed to just firing drones at everybody, because we're losing a lot of valuable information from folks that we take shots at versus folks that we're able to detain and interrogate. But still, I know the senator from Kentucky agrees with me that at the end of the day, we need to take out bad guys that seek to do us harm. And your position all along has been that with due process, that ought to happen. My question to the senator is that, you know, with the administration not giving you a straightforward answer, and I understand that the Attorney General, in response to some questions today in the Judiciary Committee, again was very evasive on the question, in spite of having given you a letter just yesterday on this issue that there still is not a straightforward black or white, as it appears to me they could give you, answer to this question. Am I correct about that?
Mr. President, the senator from Georgia is correct, and I also, while he's on the floor, want to thank him for getting some of this information to come forward, because it has been a very onerous task, and without his leadership on the Intelligence Committee, as well as Republicans and Democrats asking for more information, we wouldn't have gotten anywhere here. And with that input, we've been able to get some answers. The answers haven't all been good. Brennan has answered, I think, the appropriate answer. The CIA doesn't work within the United States. And that should be pretty obvious because everybody knows that, and that's the law. The problem is it doesn't answer the final question because the drone program is under the Department of Defense. And really, if we're going to bring that home to America, I really think the Intelligence Committee, as well as the whole body, ought to be not just waiting for the president to tell us how he's going to use it in America. Really, we have civil law in America, and we ought to be part of that process. But I don't think we can allow it to go on without our input.
Let me, Mr. President, if I could ask the senator again a little different question, just to make sure that I understand exactly what the senator has asked for. Your position, as I understand it, has been all along that if we have bad guys flying airplanes into a tower, or if we have folks who are firing missiles or tanks or weapons of any sort in the United States seeking to carry out an act of war, an act of terrorism, taking those guys out is not a problem.
Yeah, Mr. President, the idea of combating lethal force, I don't think is questioned by very few, if anybody. You know, if planes are flying into the Twin Towers, we obviously send up F-16s. If we have missiles, we do whatever we can to stop an attack on America. What I'm really concerned about, and in the same way, if it's a domestic terrorist, if there's someone outside the Capitol with a grenade launcher, we don't give them Miranda rights, we kill them. I mean, that's the way it works. If you are exerting lethal force against American soldiers anywhere in the world or our country, you use lethal force to stop that. And sometimes you can't stop to even ask permission from Congress. You do that. Imminent threats are repulsed. But because a lot of the drone attacks, and I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong the way they're done, it's just that they're done at people that aren't in the middle of a battle. So if we transfer that to America, I don't think that's acceptable for America. It's a different debate on whether it's always a good idea, whether we should do it, and what the rules should be overseas. But the rules we have currently, I don't think are appropriate for the United States.
And again, Mr. President, if I could direct a question to the senator, the fact is that from a pure oversight standpoint, Armed Services, Intel, these committees that have jurisdiction over the issue of fighting the war on terrorism need to have the right kind of information so that we can ask the right questions. And getting the right kind of information out of this administration has been worse than having a root canal and more difficult than having a root canal. And I, again, am appreciative of the senator being forceful in asking of the question. And I think at the end of the day, again, you have had no issue relative to ultimately let's having a vote on Mr. Brennan. I'm not supportive of the nomination of Mr. Brennan, but I think he ought to have a vote. And I intend to express myself in much greater detail on that a little bit later. But from the standpoint of simply moving the issue forward, if the administration had come to you with a direct answer days or weeks ago when you asked the question, we probably would not be here now. So, again, I thank the senator for his comments on this issue.
Well, Mr. President, I want to thank the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee and also say that this could come to a close any time. If the president will sort of say what Attorney General Holder was trying to say this morning and put it into actual words, that he thinks that he has the military authority to reject imminent attack, I think we all agree to that. But if he says that he's not going to use drones on people who are not engaged in combat in America, I think we could be done with this debate. I think one phone call from the president to clarify what his position is, or from the Attorney General to actually write out what his position is. But I guess the reason I'm kind of alarmed is we have a quote from the Attorney General saying that the Fifth Amendment, the executive branch will decide when and if to use the Fifth Amendment. Now, I understand in times of war and in battlefields, that's a different story. I'm talking about in the United States. I don't think the executive branch gets an option of whether to adhere to the Fifth Amendment in the United States. But if they could be more clear on that, I think we could be done with this debate any time. I've never objected to a vote on Brennan, on the nominee for CIA. But I have objected to the idea that basically we're just going to throw out the baby with the bathwater and the Bill of Rights becomes something of lesser importance.
Mr. President, would my friend yield?
Majority Leader is recognized.
Would my friend yield without losing the floor for a unanimous consent request?
Without losing or yielding the floor, I'd be happy to entertain a question.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 43, that the cloture motion at the desk be reported, mandatory quorum under Rule 22 be waived, that there be 90 minutes for debate with 30 minutes under the control of the chair and 1 hour under the control of the vice chair of the Intelligence Committee, with 30 minutes of the vice chair's time under the control of Senator Paul. Following the use or yielding back of that time on the nomination, the Senate proceed to vote on the cloture motion. If cloture is invoked, the Senate proceed to vote on confirmation of the nomination with no intervening action or debate. Further, that the motion we consider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, and no further motion be in order to the nomination, that President Obama be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate resume legislative session. Mr. President, before I hear from my friends on the consent, I have no problem. People want to talk for a long time. It's no problem. I've done it a time or two in my days. But I think that the rest of the body needs to know if we're going to finish tonight or tomorrow or the next day. So my consent request is pretty direct. We would have 90 more minutes of debate, an hour under the control of Senator from Georgia, and 30 minutes under the control of Senator Feinstein or their designees.
Is there objection to the Majority Leader's consent request?
Mr. President,
I would just simply say, if there's objection, we'll just come back tomorrow.
Reserving the right to object, Mr.
Senator from
President.
Georgia.
Let me, if I may, direct a question to the Majority Leader through the chair. That, as I understand, what you're asking for is 90 more minutes, 30 minutes, Senator Feinstein, 30 minutes for me, and
No, you would have an hour. Yeah, you'd have 30. He'd have 30.
and Senator Paul would have 30 minutes. And does your consent, it would start right now, basically, or?
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Continuing to serve the right to object, I guess then I would direct the question to the Senator from Kentucky, since he has the floor, of what amount of time you think you want to utilize.
Senator from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I would be happy with the vote now. I've talked a lot today, but the only thing I would like is a clarification. If the President or the Attorney General will clarify that they're not going to kill non-combatants in America. He essentially almost said that this morning. He could take his remarks that he virtually agreed ultimately with Senator Cruz, put it into a coherent statement that says the drone program will not kill Americans who are not involved in combat. I think he probably agrees to that. I don't understand why we couldn't put that into words, but if he does, I want no more time. But if not, I will continue to object if the administration and the Attorney General will not provide an adequate answer.
And
I object.
I'm not in position to talk for the Attorney General. We'll just finish this matter tomorrow.
Is the objection? The objection is heard. Senator from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. President.
Once, okay?
Senator from Kentucky's.
Everyone should plan on coming tomorrow. We're through for the night.
I'm not sure, Mr. President, exactly what he's... Okay.
The objection is heard.
All right. Thank you. Mr. President, at this time, without yielding the floor, I'd like to entertain a question from the Senator from Pennsylvania.
Senator from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to thank the Senator from Kentucky for raising, I think, a very, very important issue. And I would just like to kind of walk through a little bit of clarification so that I understand clearly. exactly what's transpired here and the exact question to which the senator from Kentucky would like a response. From my perception, my understanding is this seems like a very simple and basic request. And so I'm surprised that we don't have a simple and straightforward answer. So I wonder if the senator from Kentucky would just summarize briefly for me so that I understand clearly the exact request that you made to the administration.
Mr. President, in late January, we sent a letter to John Brennan, the nominee for the CIA, asking a bunch of questions, but included among those questions was, can you kill an American in America with a drone strike? And we got no response, and no response, and no response. Thanks to the intervention of the ranking member on the Intelligence Committee, as well as members from the opposite aisle on the Intelligence Committee, we finally got an answer about 2 days ago. The answer from John Brennan was that he acknowledges the CIA cannot act in the United States. That is the law, and that was nice. But the Attorney General responded and said that they don't intend to, they haven't yet, but they might.
And am I correct in understanding that that's currently the state of play? That's the most recent response you've gotten in writing from the administration?
Mr. President, that's the only direct response I've gotten. I've also read the testimony from the Judiciary Committee where the senator from Texas cross-examined the Attorney General, who responded indirectly to my question by saying it was inappropriate. It was inappropriate, we probably wouldn't do that, but wouldn't answer directly whether it was unconstitutional or not. It appears at the end that he may have said that it would be unconstitutional to kill non-combatants. Should be a pretty simple answer. And really, that's all I'm asking. I can be done anytime if I could just get a response from the administration or from the Attorney General saying that they do not believe they have the authority to kill non-combatants in America.
Well, Mr. President, further follow-up on further clarification here. If the administration seems to be unwilling to state unequivocally that they recognize that they do not have the legal authority to kill a non-combatant American on American soil, did they suggest under what circumstances they would? Did they suggest a process by which they would identify an American citizen non-combatant on American soil that might be subject to being killed by a drone strike?
Well, Mr. President, there's been a white paper that was released that goes through a series of things. They do have a step or a process they go through in determining who to kill. The problem I have is that in foreign countries, I don't know the exact number because it's classified, but in foreign countries, many of the people being killed aren't actively engaged in combat. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong or making an opinion on that, but I'm saying that's not a standard I can live with in the United States. So let's say a third of the drone strikes are going against people that are eating dinner with their family or walking down the road or sleeping in their house. If that is our standard and we're going to do drone strikes in America, I can't tolerate or I can't live with myself if I would accept a standard in the United States that would allow that to happen here.
Well, Mr. President, I think, judging from the response, what I understand is that there is a standard that applies overseas, but we haven't gotten, correct me if I'm mistaken, but we haven't gotten a definitive word as to whether that same standard would apply domestically to American citizens or not.
Go ahead.
And just to say, and if we haven't gotten a definitive answer, then it seems to me, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but then it would suggest to me that we have no idea what standard would be used. And I can't imagine that we would find it acceptable to be in a situation where an administration would suggest that using a drone to kill an American non-combatant on American soil without even disclosing the process by which they would determine that that was appropriate. This is kind of hard to understand. Am I understanding it incorrectly?
Well, Mr. President, the interesting thing about this is for many years no one would talk about the drone strike program at all. And then recently one of the former spokesman for the president said he was instructed to never say it existed. But now that it is in the open, the president a week ago was asked at Google, when he was there for an interview, he was asked, can you do this? And his answer was, well, the rules would probably have to be different inside than outside. But that implies that he thinks he can do it inside in America. And then the question really becomes, what are those rules? And this is as much about the checks and balances of, they say we have the ability to advise and consent. This is some friendly advice I'm giving to the president today, is that he ought to think about, and we should think about as a body, whether we are a check and balance to the power of the executive, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. To me, I think it's immaterial that no president should have the power to make these decisions, unilaterally.
Well, Mr. President, I'll finish up here, but I just want to make 2 points here. One is I think we ought to have a robust debate about the circumstances under which we would use drone strikes overseas and understand the implications. Think about this. We have what is still to the United States a relatively new threat in the form of these non-state actors, these terrorist organizations that are sometimes affiliated with each other, sometimes not, scattered around the globe. This is new. In addition, we have new technology that we never had before. It wasn't terribly long ago that the idea of flying an unmanned drone and using it to kill a person that could be hundreds or thousands of miles away, that was completely implausible. Now, of course, we have the ability to do it. When new circumstances and new technology come to bear, we ought to have a discussion about when and whether and how it's appropriate to use that. When we're talking about American non-combatants on American soil, I think the starting point ought to be we're not going to do that. And the onus ought to be on whoever's got an explanation for when and whether and why and under what circumstance we would. And that ought to be debated very, very carefully and thoroughly. And until such time, I think it ought to be easy to acknowledge that this is not going to take place. And if we can't get a direct answer to that question, then I have to say I think the senator from Kentucky is performing an important service in putting a spotlight on this. And I commend him for doing it, and I thank him for doing it. And with that, I finish with my questions.
Well, Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from Pennsylvania for asking his questions and being part of the debate. I think that ultimately we could get this straightened out in the sense that it isn't so much about the debate about the person as it is about the issue. And if we could get the administration or the Attorney General to put his answer in a succinct form and simply say that they believe that they have the authority to repel an attack, which I think all of us agree to that, but they don't have the authority to kill someone in a restaurant, to kill someone at home in their house, to kill someone when they're eating dinner. That really, if you want to say that you can use drones in America to strike people, not only would it have to be remarkably different, it couldn't be almost anywhere like the way we use drones around the world, which brings up some other important questions. But the thing is that this has brought us to a much bigger and important debate. When people tell you that America is a battlefield, when they tell you that the battlefield is here, realize what they're telling you. They're telling you your Bill of Rights don't apply. Because in the battlefield, you really don't have due process, and I'm not arguing for that. I'm not arguing for some kind of silly rules for soldiers to ask Miranda rights and do all this. War is war. War is hell. But we can't have perpetual war. We can't have war that has no temporal limits. And we can't then have war that is a part of our daily life in our country, that we're going to say from now on in our country, you really don't have the protections of the Bill of Rights. So I think it's incredibly important. And we've been kind of blasé about this whole, drone strike program. And it should come home to where we can really think about it, because that's what they're asking to do. They're asking to bring the drone strikes to the homeland. And so I think we really need to be careful. We need to ask important questions. And I think at the very least, we need to be asking the question, Can you do this with no due process? Are we not going to have an accusation? Are we not going to have a public accusation or charge? Are we not going to have a trial by jury? I started out today reading from Alice in Wonderland, and I'd like to go back to Alice in Wonderland because